So are we plugged in? There you go. For those who were not here earlier, I asked the question of, if you get up this morning and you try to turn on your lamp and the lamp didn't go on, what's the first thing you do? You check the plug, make sure you're plugged in. So we have to plug ourselves in to divine energy and plug into the energy from each other and from our own selves. This morning, we're going to be talking about movement buildings, and we have two speakers, two excellent speakers. The first is Anna Garcia Ashley. Who is? Well, okay, I was getting the ladies first here, sorry. Okay, the first is Reverend Adam Taylor, the Executive Director of Sojourners. Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is the Director and author of Mobilizing Hope, Faith-Inspired Activism for a Post-Civil Rights Generation. Taylor previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as the Vice President of Advocacy at World Vision US and the Senior Political Director at Sojourners. He has also served as the Executive Director of Global Justice, an organization that educates and mobilizes students around the global human rights and economic justice. Taylor is a graduate of Emory University, the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. Taylor is ordained in the American Baptist Church and serves as the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Let us give him a good welcome. Okay. Oh, wait, sorry. No, go back down. I'm just teasing.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay, we're well organized here. Okay. So, did you want to introduce the second person? No, I'm on a roll here.
You're on a roll.
Okay. The next person is Anna Garcia Ashley, the Executive Director of Gamaliel. I'm sure everyone has heard of both organizations. Anna Garcia Ashley began her work in Gamaliel in the early 1990s as the lead organizers of MICA, Milwaukee Inner City Congregation Allied for Hope. Anna was also the founding organizer of Wisdom, the Gabriel-affiliated Wisconsin state organization. She has been a member of the Gabriel Central Staff for nearly 2 decades, serving as senior trainer at Gabriel's National Leadership Training and co-director of the Civil Rights for Immigrants campaign. In 2009, Anna was named Associate Director, becoming Executive Director in 2012. Under her leadership, the organization's Fire of Faith campaign is on track to save or create nearly 1 million jobs over 3 years, while also rekindling the 1,000 interfaith congregations that belong to Gabriel's affiliate organizations through community organizing. She is a member of St. Martin de Porres Catholic Church in Milwaukee. So let us thank her. Let us welcome her also.
Good morning. Looks like you can get your exercise getting up and down coming to the stage, but I am so grateful to be with you. I am particularly grateful to be able to speak side by side with Anna, and it's a privilege to be able to speak on a similar theme around movement building. I really want to thank Reverend Toon, who I've known for a long time, for the invitation to be with you, and I want to thank all of the organizers and sponsors of this Ecumenical Advocacy Days. I have had the privilege of participating in your seat many years ago and have admired this event and this conference and the advocacy you do for a long time. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are Sojourners magazine subscribers? Wow, that is a beautiful sight. So, for those who didn't raise their hand, you have a copy. It may even become a vintage copy of Sojourners magazine because it's literally the last edition before we introduce a whole new look for Sojourners. It's gonna look similar to the old, but it'll have kind of a new face and feel. And the new issue, the kind of redesigned issue, comes out in June. So For those of you who've been longtime subscribers, hold on to this issue, and you're going to see kind of a new look come June. Hope that you'll take a careful read and consider subscribing. Hope many of you also are subscribers to Sojo Mail. That's a free e-newsletter that you can sign up for at sojo.net. Sojourners, for many, many years, almost 50 years, has long been in the vocation of movement building. Literally, our mission is to inspire hope and build a movement to transform individuals, communities, the church, and the world. One of our premier events is called the Summit for Change, which is coming up in June 12th through the 14th, also here in Washington, D.C. It's 3 days of inspiration and mutual learning and rejuvenation with leaders from different sectors, including the church. So I also invite you to that gathering and to consider joining us for the Summit of Change. Now, in addition to being executive director of Sojourners, you heard in my bio that I'm also a Black Baptist preacher. I'm not here to give a sermon, but needless to say, the Baptist preacher always comes out. So I want to invite you to join the Baptist tradition. And if you hear something that inspires you, to participate in the call to response tradition. Now, I know that's not comfortable for all of us, so amens are welcome. But if amen is a little bit too far beyond your comfort zone, just give me a holy head nod. And that way I know that you're listening. Now, I do want to tag a title onto this message. And what I felt God inspired me to speak about this morning is 5 smooth stones to stir the waters. Or put another way, 5 smooth stones to heal the world. Amen? Amen. My favorite sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., entitled The Transformed Nonconformist. Dr. King has a quote that literally served as kind of the cornerstone of a book that I wrote about 10 years ago called Mobilizing Hope, and I'm actually going to be reflecting on some of the themes in this book. In this sermon, Dr. King does a remix of Paul's letter to the Roman church when he says, "Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world." And in Dr. King's remix, he says, "The saving of our world from pending doom will not come through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority." And I love this dual commitment to be creatively maladjusted to the brokenness in the world that we see around us. But at the same time, it's not just about an attitude adjustment or a worldview. It requires us to get into good trouble. I love that theme in this conference. We have to be transformed nonconformist, be willing to be transformed ourselves, but also be willing to transform others. And to me, creative maladjustment and transformed nonconformism are at the very heart of what it means to build and catalyze movements. Now, I learned a great deal about movements and social and political change from a professor of mine that I had at the Kennedy School of Government named Marshall Gantz. Now, Marshall is a tough professor and he's a tough organizer. And he taught me that mobilizing people for change is both an art form and a science. Gantz says that collective action represents an antidote to the misuse and abuse of power and is the very currency of change within a democratic system of government. He also taught me the importance of what he describes as public narrative. Public narrative is how we weave together a story about our values and connect the heart with the mind. Public narrative is composed of what the first century sage Rabbi Hillel said when he said, "If I am not for myself, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, then who am I? If not now, then when?" That quote literally ties together the 3 components of public narrative. The story of self, in other words, our own story, what shaped us, what drives us. The story of us, who are we in the context of community? What communities have shaped us, including our faith community, our religious communities. And ultimately the story of now. How do we communicate an urgency around the injustices that we see in our midst? Shocking statistics and compelling facts are important, but they often fall far short in motivating people to take action. And in this increasing post-fact environment that we're living in, we know that we have to touch people's hearts We have to change and influence their minds. Amen? So, through the lens of public narrative, I want to share a little bit of my own story, particularly as it intersects with social movements. I grew up believing that I was born in the wrong era. I was born in 1976, and yes, I'm a little older than I look, fortunately. But I was born as a result of a commitment by my parents. My mother is black, my father is white, who made a controversial decision in 1968 to put their love for one another over the bigotry that they experienced in that moment. 1968 also happened to be the year that the Supreme Court ruled that any state that banned interracial marriage was struck down or was forced to endorse interracial marriages across the country. Some of you have seen the movie Loving that chronicles this moment, the case of Loving versus the state of Virginia. As you know, 1968 was also the tragic year that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I'm sure that many of you were involved in some of the commemorative events over this last year that helped to celebrate Dr. King's legacy. Now, sadly, I believe that our country is still too often stuck in celebrating Dr. King's vision of civil rights and refuses to listen to his prophetic voice when he described the triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism that continue to haunt our nation and our world. I became mesmerized by the civil rights struggle, particularly the role that young people played at the forefront of that struggle, often the unsung heroes of that struggle, through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I have been a student of social movements almost my entire life. I grew up watching the Eyes of the Prize series and reading as many of Taylor Branch's books as I could about the civil rights movement itself. Then later, I became infatuated with the anti-apartheid struggle, which was coming to a fore just as I was growing up. I had an opportunity to study abroad in Cape Town, South Africa in 1996, just 2 years after Nelson Mandela was elected president. And that was a transformative time in South Africa and a particularly transformative time in my own life. I later decided that I wanted to go to Emory University in order to trace the history of the civil rights struggle, to understand how we can continue to finish the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. In my first Sunday in Atlanta, I literally went to Ebenezer Baptist Church and heard a sermon that brought me to tears because it combined a commitment to salvation, God's promise of salvation, with a commitment to being enlisted in God's liberation struggle. I literally joined that same Sunday and have been a Baptist ever since. Ultimately, 15 years later, got a license and then ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Church. Over the course of my student activism and my professional career, I have learned a lot about how to be an effective campaigner and what makes social movements tick. I've learned from being involved in the Jubilee debt cancellation movement. I hope that some of you in this room may have been involved in that movement. I've learned through the global AIDS movement, through movements and campaigns to fight for comprehensive immigration reform, through campaigns to oppose and try to end the Iraq War, through campaigns to advance the Millennium Development Goals and to end extreme poverty in the world. And most recently, in efforts to try to push back against voter suppression efforts across this country, which I'm so grateful you are going to be lobbying on Monday. But I have to admit, growing up, I often was very frustrated with my generation, Generation X. Partly because I saw my generation so often substituting a commitment to civic activism with a commitment to community service. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge believer in community service. I'm actually a member of a fraternity whose motto is, first of all, service to all, we shall transcend all. But community service is fundamentally different than activism. And both are requirements of Christian discipleship. I also got frustrated with the church because so often I saw churches that were engaged in what were described as social justice ministries, and in reality were really social service ministries. And again, those are necessary. But we have to be both and in our commitment to activism and to charity and service. I have spent the last 4 years before returning to Sojourners a year ago working in the World Bank Group, an organization I never thought that I would be an employee of, to be honest. It's true, you can be a protester of an institution and then come and try to be a change agent inside of one. I spent 4 years trying to help build partnerships between religious organizations and the World Bank, all in an effort to combat inequality and poverty in the world. But in the lead up to the 2016 election, I increasingly became restless in my spirit to the point where it became unbearable. And I knew that it was time to return to the work of advocacy and movement building within the faith context. The moment crystallized for me on election night. You may remember where you were. I had tried to go to bed, and my 5-year-old son Joshua, who is now 8, came into our room at 3 a.m, and he was distraught. Now, I had tried to shield my sons from the election, which is kind of like a mission impossible here in Washington, D.C. It's in the area that we breathe here. But he was adamant that he needed to know who won the presidential election. And my wife and I kind of stammered out an incoherent response. Mr. Trump, we think, is going to win the election, Joshua. And his exact words in response were, Mommy and Daddy, I don't understand how our country could elect someone who has said and done such bad things. In that moment, I was filled with a sense of anguish because I didn't know how to respond to my son. I didn't know how to reconcile and understand how our country had elected someone who had made overt appeals to racism, camouflaged in a slogan of Make America Great Again. I couldn't understand how our country elected someone who had a proven track record of misogyny. I couldn't understand how our country had elected someone who had appealed to fear-mongering, xenophobia, and nationalism. I couldn't understand how we elected someone who has shown such narcissistic tendencies. But the forces that Trump tapped into have been with us for much longer. And I have come to realize that our politics cannot provide the necessary response we need. That is the role of social movements. Politics alone are not going to cast the moral vision that can unite this country. That is the role of social movements. And at the forefront of so many social movements have been people of faith just like yourselves. Amen? This is, beloved, a watershed moment where I believe God is calling us to catalyze and ignite a movement that can change the moral narrative in this country and that can transform our horribly broken political priorities and politics. I believe that in this perilous and polarized moment, God presents us with a sacred opportunity and a fierce urgency to catalyze a movement that can truly transform hearts and minds. I hope you share in that conviction. Now, I wish this was simple. I wish that there was just a really easy playbook on how you ignite social movements. If there was, I want to find it. I wish that there was a magic bullet to achieve what Malcolm Gladwell calls a tipping point, where a marginal idea becomes a mainstream commitment. Now, there are some good books out there. I humbly suggest my own. But I also recommend Doing Justice by Dennis Jacobson, who is a longtime Gamaliel leader. I recommend Faith-Rooted Organizing by Alexis Salvatierra and Peter Hetzel. Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky is still a timeless classic. There are many good books out there. But what I've learned is that igniting social movements is not just about strategy or tools or methods. It goes far beyond that. And so often it requires a component of God's providence and God's intervention. Now, there is a book that I also recommend that has helped to shape my understanding of social movements. It's called This Is an Uprising by two brothers, Mark and Paul Engler. Hope some of you have read it. The book reminds us that the critical advances in the last half century to end in slavery around women's suffrage and the restriction of child labor, to outlaw many forms of discrimination, owe less to legislative efforts, the legislative endgame, and more to the power of social movements to put those issues onto the agenda in the first place. Now, legislative advocacy is absolutely crucial. It's needed. But social movements often are what change the conversation and get issues on the agenda. In the book, the anglers compare and contrast two schools of thought around social and political change. One camp is often associated with the labor movement and with Saul Alinsky. Anna will speak more to that, I am sure. But it is a model that requires deep local leadership development and power building. It focuses on person-by-person recruitment, careful leadership development, and the creation of institutional bodies that can leverage the power of their members over time. The other is the mass disruption model, which relies on broad-based civil disobedience and emphasizes the disruptive power of mass mobilization to coalesce quickly. Now, the anglers argue that the future of social change requires an integration of these two approaches, of building strong, long-term organizations and engaging in disruptive protest and nonviolent civil disobedience. I believe that is true. It's a false choice to have to choose between them. Now, our organizations, your churches may feel called to engage in more in one than others, but both are really essential. Brothers and sisters, it is tempting to feel as though we are stuck in a Good Friday moment. Yet we are seeing signs of resurrection and of good trouble all around us. You're going to hear more about these during the panel discussion in just a few minutes. There are seeds of movements being planted and growing all across our country. You're going to hear about the Poor People's Campaign, who engaged in 40 days of civil disobedience, who engaged in some good trouble this past year. Turn to your neighbor and say, it's time for some good trouble. A growing movement of young people through the Sunrise Movement and beyond have been resolved to ensure that we have bold political leadership to address the ongoing crisis of climate change. They have been engaging and raising their voices in walkouts and rallies, in protests all around the country. Brothers and sisters, that is some good trouble. Sojourners this last year, in the lead up to the 2018 election, partnered with the African American Clergy Network and worked in 7 states, battleground states, to try to push back against voter suppression efforts. We mobilized clergy alongside lawyers to ensure that every vote can be counted and that every voter who is made in the image of God is able to vote. That is some good trouble. Many of you have been involved in efforts to advance comprehensive immigration reform. And I was inspired by the moral backlash that took place in this country, often led by faith leaders, in response to the callous forced separation policy of the Trump administration, which ultimately was reversed because of that public backlash. That was some good trouble. The Me Too movement has forced a national conversation and reckoning around long ignored abuse, harassment, and discrimination against women. Amen? This is abuse that has been far too ignored by the church. Sojourners partnered with IMA World Health to do a survey of ministers about what we could do to better equip them to address issues of domestic abuse and violence in their churches. We collected 100 sermons from every Christian tradition to try to show how people are preaching about this in churches and inspire more ministers to address the ongoing scandal of domestic abuse and gender-based violence. That is some good trouble. Yes, there is good trouble happening all around us. The Black Lives Matter movement continues to agitate and to organize and to advocate to bring an end to racialized policing. That is some good trouble. Last spring, a group of elders, co-led by Reverend Jim Wallace, who's the founder and president of Sojourners, and Bishop Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, who put together what's called the Reclaiming Jesus statement. I hope many of you have had a chance to read it and see the video. That video has now been seen 5 million times. and has been giving a prophetic voice of resistance against so many of the alarming trends we see in our current politics and in the church. That is some good trouble. But good trouble also requires us to think through, what does it mean to combine so many of these somewhat disparate, inspiring campaigns into something that coalesces into a broader social movement? I want you to travel with me back to the time of ancient Israel. Just as the Israelites are facing the mighty Philistine Goliath in battle, it is one of my favorite stories in the Bible, one that I don't have to retell. Now, as you remember, no one has the courage to face the mighty Philistine in battle, except a young shepherd boy who biblical scholars think is about 16 years old. He is likely skinnier than I am. He has the courage to stand up and face Goliath. Now, you remember that Goliath literally mocked God each and every morning as he came into the valley and tried to shame the Israelites to face him in battle. Goliath, to the Israelites, was invincible. He bred a sense of hopelessness, of resignation, of fatalism. And I would argue that many of the Goliaths that we face today can do the exact same thing to us. Now, David initially is given a heavy load of armor and a sword by King Saul. But he uses his sanctified imagination to reconfigure the battlefield according to the unique gifts that God has given him. He recognizes that conventional weapons are going to be useless to him in facing the mighty Philistine. Now, you know how the story ends. David finds 5 smooth stones in a brook. He uses one of them to knock down the mighty Philistine, and then he cuts off his head with a sword. The underdog is able to conquer Goliath because he relies upon God. Amen. And he identifies the very Achilles heel of his opponent. Amen. Well, beloved, I believe that God has given us smooth stones in order to build the kind of movements that will stir the waters and transform our nation and our world. But we can't simply just pick up the conventional weapons that we see around us. We have to root our organizing and mobilizing and advocacy efforts in a faith-rooted response. Now, like a classic preacher, I am going over time, so I do not have the time to go into detail about each of the ways in which we are called to engage in a faith-rooted way. But I'm just going to name them, and then we can spend some time in the Q&A to unpack them if you're interested. But one, our faith-rooted movement-building efforts require that we build a compelling moral and normative vision. The vision of the beloved community is one of the visions that animated the civil rights movement. And I believe it is still a vision that is relevant and can be inspiring for our work for justice today. We need a moral vision that is both invitational and confessional, not one that is overly self-righteous or triumphalist. We need a moral vision that helps turn people's sense of fear into hope, their sense of anger into action, their sense of impotence into a sense of agency, their sense of isolation into a sense of community. Amen? Secondly, we need faith-inspired movements that name the spiritual lie that is at the heart of injustice, and that are able to reframe issues in ways that capture people's moral imagination. The spiritual lie that was at the heart of Jim Crow segregation was the lie of superiority, that some people are worth more than others. Amen? It is literally the lie of America's original sin that is at the foundation of our nation. It's a lie that we are still struggling to overcome today. The antidote to that lie, from a spiritual sense, is Imago Dei, the conviction that we are made in the very image of God. And I believe Imago Dei has the power to be the antidote to all of the isms that we still face in our country, not just racism, but sexism and homophobia. Third, faith-inspired movements require that we understand and embrace the redemptive power of suffering. This is an easy one, but the leaders of the civil rights movement understood that unearned suffering is redemptive. Think about those who engaged in sit-ins all across the South, college students who faced racial epithets and harassment and abuse, but their dignity, sitting and receiving that without retaliation, helped to change hearts and minds. Think about the countless children, particularly in Birmingham, that face fire hoses and dogs and mass arrests. Their redemptive suffering helped to prick the conscience of this nation and ultimately build momentum behind the civil rights struggle. Unearned suffering has the power to create political jujitsu, to literally turn the violence of the oppressor on themselves. Fourth, faith-inspired movements require that we take the long view even as we generate urgency around specific short-term campaigns. There will be times where we get burnt out. We will face wilderness periods. We're probably feeling one right now. But it is the power of our faith that sustains us. It is the promises of God that we must claim and stand on as we move forward. Lastly, faith-inspired movements tap into kairos. Yes. Many of you know that chronos is kind of time as we know it, and kairos is how God understands time. My time in South Africa taught me that there are particular moments where the current reality around us becomes so pernicious and so fraudulent that God can be summoned into action, that people's eyes can be opened, that scales can be removed, and that people can see in a new way what must be done. I believe that this is one of those moments. Now, we cannot create kairos moments. That is God's job. But we can summon God to work in and through us as co-creators to create kairos moments in our midst. Now, I'm just not speaking from a theoretical or academic point of view. I am speaking in part from real life experience. As I mentioned before, I had a privilege of being active in the global HIV and AIDS movement. And that movement helps to model so many of these characteristics of faith-inspired movements that I just named. In the year 2000, I had a chance to attend the International AIDS Conference in Durban, South Africa. And the keynote speaker of that conference was a white South African judge named Judge Cameron. And he said some words I'll never forget. He addressed 10,000 people, activists, physicians, researchers, and he said, I represent the inequality of this world. I was on my deathbed 3 months ago because my body had been ravaged by the AIDS virus, the HIV virus. But because of my skin color, because of my status in society, I could pay for life itself. I could afford antiretroviral medicines that literally created a Lazarus effect that brought me from the brink of death back to life. But he said, for my black South African brothers and sisters, AIDS still represents a death sentence. And that is a scandal. I left that conference feeling a sense of righteous indignation that I had to in some way help to break the scandal of silence that existed in the United States at that time around the global crisis of HIV and AIDS. I was able to get a seed grant to start a nonprofit organization that tried to create a SNCC-like ethic within a younger generation and mobilize young people around global human rights, starting with the crisis of HIV and AIDS. Now, when we started, there were 50,000 people in middle and low-income countries that had access to life-prolonging medicines. There were 36 million people living with HIV in those same countries. The Clinton administration at that time was throwing pennies at this crisis. And we engaged with people of faith, probably many people in this room. We engaged with the gay rights community. We engaged with many to create a big tent coalition to generate thousands of letters, thousands of phone calls, thousands of lobby visits, hundreds of op-eds. In the lead up to the presidential election in 2000, we mobilized students around the country to bird dog presidential candidates at almost every presidential forum, Democrats and Republicans, asking them the question, what will you do as president to address the crisis of AIDS? Yes. That created a firestorm of pressure that helped lead to the 2001 announcement by President Bush that he was committing to the President's Emergency AIDS Plan, or PEPFAR, that literally over the last 10 years has helped place 11 million people on life-prolonging treatment. 11 million people. That victory was possible in part because we were able to reframe the AIDS crisis out of a crisis that was mainly thought of in the church as around issues of sexuality and sex, to try to get the church to move from a posture of condemnation to a posture of compassion and of justice. We didn't see HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. We saw God's call on us to heal the international village. The acronym took on a whole different name. That we couldn't address the AIDS crisis without addressing all the root causes of the AIDS crisis, of gender-based violence, of broken healthcare systems, of poverty. That this was, again, an opportunity that God was calling us into to help heal the world. Now that you better understand what drives faith-inspired movements, I just want to close with 5 ways that each and every one of you can help stir the waters and fuel social movements. I call these 5 smooth stones of Christian activism. The first is persistence. Campaigns and movement building is not just about a single meeting. It requires an ongoing relationship with your member of Congress and ongoing relationships within your community. It requires relentless persistence. Now, my favorite story of persistence in the Bible is from Luke chapter 18 of the persistent widow, who literally goes to a judge who doesn't know God or fear God and tries to get her grievance addressed. But the judge ignores her. Now, it's important to note that widows in the time of Christ were often the most politically disenfranchised. And yet she, through her sheer persistence, wears down the will of the judge and ultimately gets the judge to grant her justice. If God can use a widow with very little political power, God can use each and every one of us. And it is going to take persistence to advance the very things you're going to be advocating on, to help end voter suppression efforts around this country and get new voting reforms put in place. It's going to take persistence to pass the Global Fragility Act and to support human rights defenders all across this world. Secondly is, and as you know, Baptist preachers love to think in alliteration, so these are all P's. The second is perseverance, the close cousin of persistence. We have to be perseverant. These changes are not going to happen overnight. And my favorite example of perseverance is William Wilberforce, the great abolitionist in the UK, who literally spent 20 years of his life advocating for the end of the slave trade. He proposed 19 bills that failed 10 times before he was ultimately successful, obviously in concert with others through the Clapham sect, to end the slave trade in the British Empire. Activism requires perseverance. Third is what I call pragmatic solidarity. We cannot just advocate for others. We have to advocate with others. We have to empower the voices of those who are most impacted by the issues we're working on. I can say more about that later, but in these times we're living in today, we must show pragmatic solidarity with the victims of racialized policing. We must come alongside our Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters to stand against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Fourth, we must be pastoral. I'll get to being prophetic in a second. But we have to recognize that politicians are people too. They have convictions that led them to go into public office. And while there are moments in which we have to hold them accountable and sometimes even shame them into action, we don't have to antagonize them or shame them in a way that ruins a relationship. We can pray with them. We can be pastoral to them in ways that help to plant seeds that ultimately change their perspective. And I have seen this happen so many times through my own advocacy efforts. Lastly, we do also need to be prophetic. The biblical prophets were truth tellers in their time, proclaiming to kings and religious leaders what saith the Lord around a whole range of issues, from land ownership to the abuse of power to exploitation. Prophets did not shy away from hard truths or from confrontation, and neither should we. we too need to be prophetic about the ongoing evil of white supremacy. We have to be prophetic about ongoing and systematic efforts to disenfranchise voters around this country. We have to be prophetic about oppressive governments that continue to kill and imprison human rights defenders all across this globe. Now, as we conclude the season of Lent, we can take heart in the fact that Jesus got into some good trouble. He was crucified for getting into some good trouble. Yes, Jesus was crucified for the political act of treason. We can also take heart because Jesus was a quintessential movement builder. It's not the way that we always think of him, particularly when we overly desanitize and de-radicalize Jesus' message. But Jesus did not come primarily to start an institution or even a religion. Jesus came to ignite a movement of followers that would be so filled with his message, would be so filled with following his way of steadfast love, of righteousness, and of justice, that they would help to bring the reign of God into every sphere of human existence. Early followers of Jesus were called the way of Jesus. And I think we need to better study how Jesus truly was a movement builder. Amen. Activism is not separate from Christian discipleship. It is a requirement of Christian discipleship. And as Isaiah 58 reminds us, activism for justice is not an extracurricular activity. It is the very kind of worship that pleases God. It is literally how we experience more abundant life. And as Isaiah reminds us, when we engage in activism, then our light will shine like a noonday. We will be like a well-watered garden. We will be known as repairers of the breach, restorers of streets with dwellings. Beloved, now is the time to catalyze a movement capable of realizing the beloved community. But it will require that we get into some good trouble. It will require persistence, perseverance, pragmatic solidarity, and being both pastoral and prophetic. It will require that we stir the water. Are you ready to create some good trouble? Are you ready to heal the world? Amen.
Buenos días. Buenos días. God is good. All the time. Oh, I'm in church. Well, I have to say that I came early yesterday, and I took the train, and I went to Reverend Taylor's office, and I negotiated for him to go first. Because I follow the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama always says, when you are talking, you're just repeating what you already know. But when you are listening, you might learn something new. And then we learn a lot from Reverend Taylor. Learn a lot from Reverend Taylor. Well, tengo que darle honor a mi abuela, así que tengo que decirle que estoy aquí representándola y siempre estaré. Gracias. I have to start honoring my grandmother, because I would not be an agitator. I would not be troubling the waters if it wasn't because she taught me in some pretty dramatic way. So I follow Dolores Huerta. She's my Shiro. And today what I want to bring some of the frame, some of the agitation, some of the knowledge that we got from Reverend Taylor into Dolores Huerta's way of saying, how do you trouble the waters? And also putting a frame for us and a motto of how to do it. And Dolores Huerta said that every moment is an opportunity to organize. Every moment is an opportunity to organize. Doesn't matter whether you are on the train, whether you are on the bus, Whether you're talking to the person who work in this hotel, I was asking Carlos, I say, how is the union? How is it going? How is the work here? Do I need to raise some hell? How you all being treated? And he says, está muy bien aquí la cosa, me gusta este trabajo. Things are well here. Yeah, and it's good to be a worker here. So every moment is an opportunity to organize. And every person, that means from all the way over there, those of us who, I'm a Catholic, and I tell everybody I come early to church so I can get the last pew. So all of those of you who came late to sit in the back, every single one of us can be an activist. Every single one of us. Dolores Huerta said that we are destined to be an activist. And she says that every second, every minute, you have an opportunity to change the world. Can you imagine that? And I know for me, when I started, I don't know what agitation, I don't know what organizing is. I was just a little child in the mountains in Dominican Republic in a little place called Jessica. And don't go look at the map because it's not there. I mean, I haven't had time to organize, so they put us in the map. But this is, and last night the speaker reminded us what land we were standing on and how blessed we are that we're standing here today in this land and who it belonged to. But she also said when Christopher Columbus got lost, well, there are a lot of Christopher Columbus still coming to Hispaniola, to the Dominican Republic, and they are not lost. They are targeting us. And Gulf and Western was one of those, right? And there were trucks just tearing on the dirt road in front of my grandmother's house. And I was just a little girl. My grandmother had complained. She had gone to the alcalde, to the local authority. She had done everything. But this is Gulf and Western. This is a truck, right? This is Dole Pineapple. They doing sugar. These trucks. My grandmother, got her little grandkids and say, go knock on every door. Go cross the little river, cross the creek, go knock on every door. We don't have Facebook and all that. And tell her that Isabel said to be in front of her house at 7 a.m. tomorrow. So we running, we have a job. I have a very important job. Next morning, she lined us all up in front of, on the road, had me in front, I'm holding her hand, and the trucks are coming. And she looked down on me and said, esto es que ser católica. This is what it means to be a Catholic. And and they've been like that ever since. So I do believe that it's very important for us to, number one, we have to read Reverend Taylor's book, because it's important for you to know that at the center of everything we do, our faith needs to be there first. Our faith needs to be there first. All of the values, all of the things that we are going to be going to the Hill on Monday are values that are called by our faith, right? Because if it's not, then it's greed, right? Or it's selfishness. So when you are thinking about, why do I care about immigrant reform? Why do I care about voters' rights? Why do I care about decriminalizing poverty? You have to go back to your faith. These are values that come from my faith. I learned very early that was the center. And I'm stirred up. And sometimes when I'm in the Gamaliel network. The Gamaliel network is agitate, agitate, agitate. That's our motto, right? If you are comfortable and you're just going to meetings, then you're not a Gamaliel, not a Gamaliel leader, not a Gamaliel organizer. Because we believe that we love enough to agitate. Amen. We love enough to agitate. So we believe that we have to agitate every individual that's a potential activist. And we don't all have to be like Reverend Taylor, and we don't all have to be Ana Garcia Ashley, and we don't all have to be Martin Luther King or Dolores Huerta. But we need to be true to our faith and our values. Oh, I heard an amen, Reverend. You know, I just feel like that is, and in order to do that, what do we need? Why are we here together? Why are we traveling the waters together? Community. And we need power. So are you ready to be powerful? Yes. Are you ready to be powerful? Let me see you stand up and say, I want power. 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 Thank you. Say it like you mean it. Say it like you mean it. And that's right. That's right. And what are the sources of power? And what are the sources of power when 2 or 3 are what? So we have to organize people, and we have to organize money. Now, I came to Milwaukee, Wisconsin with 2 babies. I was an organizer in Denver, Colorado, and I was recruited to come and work for Gamaliel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to be the executive director of MICA, Milwaukee Inner City Congregational Life of Hope, or as someone would say, MICA. So when I came there, the first thing, that you have to do, Reverend Taylor said, you first have to listen. I did 200 one-to-ones. You have to build relationships. You have to listen. At the end of the day, with 2 little babies and doing 20, 30 one-on-ones a day, I was exhausted. But one of the things that kept coming back to me is something is wrong here. Something is wrong in this community. Something needs to happen, that it has to be big. And I have to say to Reverend Taylor that when he went to work for the World Banks, I was very concerned. I pray for you, But what I come to learn was that we needed to organize people and organize money, because in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, if you were Black or Latino, you live in a certain community, you can forget about getting along. Yes. I don't care who you is. You can forget about getting along. And let me tell you, I was like, wow. I had just finished a banking campaign in Denver, Colorado. And I thought, I know how to do this. All we have to do is just tell the banks what we want. Let's go take them on, right? It wasn't that easy. Come to find out, a lot of these bank presidents, they are what? They are Christians. And they would tell you that they're doing the right thing. They are donating to churches. They are donating to your food banks. Some of them are coming in delivering furniture to people. This is when we're talking about how do you hold people accountable, right? Yeah. And how do you live out your faith and build the power to have the ability to act and make real change? Make real change. And I had just been doing training up in Cape Town, and I learned a lot. So I bring all these ministers together. I did all this one-on-one with all these ministers, right? How do you do this? One at a time, right? And I have talked them into coming together, and I said, well, Reverend Leary, who was the president of MICA, and I said, we need to end economic apartheid in Milwaukee. And all the pastors look at me and say, we're not South Africa. And I say, no, you're not. They already liberated themselves. I know, that's my grandmother. So I agitated and did enough one-on-ones to then see how people were starting to feel comfortable with the idea that we needed to demand, right? Yeah. Sometimes you do have to demand, and you have to be clear, right? And when people call you unchristian, oh, that's not a very Christian thing to do. You guys start shouting at a bank and coming with picket sign and doing all this. And you call yourself Christians? And we look and say, yes, we do. That's what we do, right? So it took 6 months for us to finally decide. A lot of meetings, Reverend, a lot of one-on-ones, a lot of agitation, a lot of people dropping out, a little bit of name calling. And we agreed to have a little bit of name calling, It's like, where's your courage? Where's your courage? If we operate out of our faith, we shouldn't be afraid of anything. We shouldn't be afraid of anybody, even the bankers. So we decided that we were going to have a demand, and we agreed on $50 million. So that was going to be our campaign, because we had people in the communities and the churches and the pews, and they were ready to fight, right? So we were clear about our targets. Well, it was one target at that time. It was M&I Bank. And we were clear that this was important. And we wanted to go big, right? Go big or go home. Yeah. So we came and went to a negotiating meeting with Dennis Kester, the president. And he was, I have a foundation. I'm giving money to people. My church does this. My church does that. And one of the pastors, Lutheran, Dennis Jacobson, who you can read his book, Dennis Jacobson says, can we be back? We went outside in caucus. And he said, let us pray. And he prayed with purpose. He said, we are not leaving here without what we came here for. Oh my goodness. We are not leaving here. I say, woo, Lutherans are getting all upset. So, this man is like a Lutheran Buddhist. And he's over here praying like he's just about to throw down. So I was just like, it's always uncomfortable for me when I have to calm people down, because I'm used to people calming me down. Because I'm just like, Anna, sit down. And I was just like, whoa. So we went back in there, and he committed to come to a public meeting at Calvary Baptist Church and sign one of those ugly styrofoam checks, right? And we were happy. We thought we arrived, right? We went back to all of our congregation, went back to all of our core teams. We used it as a recruiting tool. We were doing training and being part of Gamaliel, sending people to training, preparing for this public meeting. They came, we packed the church. Dennis Kester come up there and sign on the bottom line. And guess what? Reverend Leary gets up and get up there and says, this $50 million is a deposit on the $500 million that they owe us. That's why you had to let these preachers preach first so you can know what is going to come out of their mouth. Oh, my God. Oh, my sweet Jesus. So now it's out there. The TV was there. It was a headline in the newspaper. Micah is running a campaign of reinvestment to end economic apartheid and $500 million. Well, we were only 450 short. It didn't. So organizing, and by the way, if you cannot laugh at the kind of craziness that goes on when you are organizing on the ground, you're not going to last. You're not going to last. I mean, one thing about being a Dominican Catholic is that we got jokes. So I went in there into the evaluation. I said, Reverend Leary, what were you thinking? And he says, you said we have power. And believe you not, the very next day, we immediately started doing one-on-one and trying to figure out number one, we got 17 or 16 more banks that we targeted. We had to teach our people how to read Community Reinvestment Act reports. We had to go to every bank, and we had to go and we found Terry Cleary, one of the bankers. He's been a banker for 35 years, and he was at Jesu Catholic Church. And he came down and said, Anna, I can teach you guys to just bring them down. And I'm like, thank you. So he started doing workshop and training and teaching us, and we were ready. We started a small organizing campaign because we couldn't get a loan for a business or anything. And all of a sudden now we're getting all this knowledge, and people are feeling all empowered, and now we want to take on 16 more banks. And we want $500 million. So we had to crunch a lot of numbers. We had to crunch a lot of numbers to get to that $500 million. But we did. We looked at what they would, how much the bank was worth, how much they were supposed to be lending in our community. We got that number, and we added it up, and we made it to the University Club. Not the Wisconsin Club, the old money, but the new money, the University Club. And we brought in the 17 president of the banks, and then preach. I think that they were afraid. So they were all giving how much money? And 6 months later, we went to Jesu, had a public meeting with over 1,200 people, and we announced the $500 million. That's organizing. That is what, but it became a movement, like Reverend said, it became a movement now that you couldn't stop, right? You cannot stop. So I just want to be clear that it takes training, it takes listening, and it takes agitation, and you have to stay centered in your faith. And that is what that's where organizing methodology, the Gamaliel one-on-one training, tedious work, come together with movement. Movement, like Reverend said, they are not made. You had to seize the opportunity, seize the moment. So I want to thank you all for giving the opportunity to be here, because I was telling Reverend Toon that I was invited to be a keynote speaker at one of the seminaries, and they Googled me and disinvited me. So I just want to make sure that I really appreciate you guys. And I don't understand why, because I have not been arrested as many times as Jim Wallace, and he still gets invited. So thank you so much. I look forward to engaging with you. Look up Gamaliel.org. Let's do training. Invite me to your church. And most of the time, I behave. Thank you very much.
Let's give them another hand for fantastic presentations. So we have some time left for questions. If you have questions for our presenters, there's a microphone coming in the back. I can hardly see though because of this light. Are there any questions for either of our presenters? Okay, here's one in the front, please. Thanks.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, great.
thank you.
My question is for Reverend Taylor. Could you talk a little more about the role of suffering and redemptive justice? And where I'm coming from is I think there is a problematic component. Sometimes when we discuss these topics, it can sound as if we're saying that the suffering in and of itself creates justice or leads to justice. And I'm wondering if you can draw a distinction. Is it really the suffering itself, or is it, because that can be problematic because it then justifies or becomes like a functionalist explanation for suffering?
Right.
Or is it God's intervention, or is it how people respond to suffering? If you could expand on that.
No, thanks for that question, because it's an important clarification to make. So I think it's really important to understand that suffering is tied to sacrifice. And so part of what I was trying to get at is oftentimes it requires deeper and greater sacrifice in order to sometimes elicit the kind of change that we want to create. And that suffering can touch the hearts of people, which can lead to change. But I'm not prescribing suffering for suffering's sake, right? And I'm not even putting the burden of suffering on those that are most impacted by injustice. I had an experience that really shook me. I joined a number of other Christian leaders. I think Reverend Toon was with me for what was called a faith table retreat just after, it was in Ferguson, just after kind of the crisis erupted in Ferguson. And we had a chance to meet with some of the Black Lives Matter movement leaders in Ferguson. And it was a really powerful exchange, kind of intergenerational exchange. And one of the things that they impressed upon us was this very provocative question about how much are we willing to sacrifice? I mean, they were on the streets, putting their bodies on the line because they believed they had to fight for justice. They had to stand against police brutality and oppression. And they asked us, it's great that you're willing to go preach a sermon. It's great that you're willing to talk about this and write about this. But what are you willing to do? How much are you willing to sacrifice? And I think it's a question we all have to ask ourselves. We all have to pray about and discern when we're called to sacrifice. When are we called to get arrested? I'll admit, getting arrested today typically is not as sacrificial as it was in the 1950s and 60s. I've been arrested 6 times, but I've never spent weeks in jail. Most of the time it's a post and forfeit, and I pay a fee and then I'm let go. So it's more of a question of how much you're willing to sacrifice and understanding that suffering can create this transformational impact on people because they see in that suffering the hypocrisy and the injustice of their own way of thinking, particularly if they're stuck in one of those spiritual lies. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Another question right here?
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, as I fall. Kind of along that same lines, with organizing and with movement building and just kind of seeing this like as a catalyst moment, like there is this energy here and I see this energy in the church, which thank you for being a witness to that as somebody who was skeptical of if the church really holds on to faith when confronting these issues. And we're not just a bunch of good, morally superior people doing this, but people of faith knowing it is God who is troubling these waters, and we are wading into them. We are walking into them in faith. Now, A lot of what you're saying is really resonating with like the theology of Martin Luther and the Civil Rights Act and all of this, and talking about these issues, and how it can't just be talking about these issues. It can't just be preaching a sermon about these issues, and it's taking direct action, but also the cause, the action that's taken. How do we organize to make it so the action that we're taking from the breakfast this morning, whoever was speaking and talking about splashing the water, those of you who were there to hear that, just splashing the water, and we're trying to create trouble, and we're getting arrested, and like I've been involved in social movements or like direct action like that, and it feels so like empty, right? It's not gospel centered, so I'm so glad we're here and we're gospel centered. How are we making sure that the direct action that we're taking is a direct resistance to what we are, what we're advocating for, and we're not just agitating for agitation's sake, but we are agitating so that people are uncomfortable, they're seeing the issue, and we're identifying that. And so, and I'm really excited for the open spaces conversations. I hope they can do that. But like, how do we organize? Because it's like I kind of feel like I'm floundering. Like, who do I talk to? Where do we go? How do we do this to make sure that our action is related?
Okay. Yeah. I hear that every day. And I have to say, I mean, City Vivian always says that everybody wants to die, but nobody does anything worth killing them. And, and that he's a great mentor, and I'm always having that conversation with him about the discipline and about uncovering self-interest and the respect that comes with really uncovering the real self-interest of where people want to. What do they want on the tombstone, right? As opposed to us thinking that we already know. So it's about doing the one-on-ones. It's about going to training. It's about building community within your own congregation and building community with your own peers, so that you are not doing action so that you can get selfies, but you're doing action so it can build into a long-term lifestyle. This is a vocation. It is a vocation, and once we realize that, lives would change for you. I was in Sacramento on Wednesday with 1,000 people over there. We're demanding $1.8 billion for people with disability, and somebody says, we've been coming to do this every year for the last 15 years. And I said, well, if God willing, I'll be here the next 15, because we are going to get it. Amen. Thank you.
Okay.
My question, sorry.
Yes.
Es para mi hermana Ana. Tengo una pregunta. Buenos días, ¿cómo está? ¿Cómo es que uno moviliza a las personas que no están viviendo en opresión, las personas que viven cómodamente en los suburbios, en las iglesias que tienen muchos recursos? ¿Cómo logramos que esas personas se activen? So I'm Jennifer with Women of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and my question is from my sister Ana. How do we activate and mobilize people who live in congregations or communities that live in comfort, those of us that live in oppression in the inner city and are feeling the effects of all these things that you are talking about, both of you? We see it, and we see our self-interest, and we can easily see how it is in our self-interest to organize, but how do we make this the self-interest of everyone, so that everyone, even those living in comfort, recognize that the struggle is our struggle? It's not just the people in the city or the people of color struggle, but it is our struggle.
Gracias. That's a very good question, because I think that right now we're living in this dominant narrative of polarization, where it's us and them. And I pray every day not to fall into that trap, because I think it is a trap, and it's a trap that's like a cancer, is eating us up. So I work in Georgia, and going into Sandy Springs and some of the more affluent areas, and trying to go in there with my heart, and now with what I read, or how big the houses are, or how big the church is, or so I have found in those congregations, when you listen to people and when you go into what you have to have perseverance. It's not going to happen overnight. But when they see that you really respect it, you're not judging them. Because sometimes it's like we have an agenda. I have an agenda. I want to end poverty. I want to close every single prison. You know, I have this huge agenda. And when I hit people with that for the first time, it just sends them running. So I think we need to discipline ourselves not to use a hammer when we really should use a hug.
Okay, thank you all for these questions. We're going to continue. I just want to ask a couple of things. I see at least 3, potentially 4. In the interest of time, if you could keep your question brief, and so that our presenters have enough time to answer, we have enough time to get to everyone. And when we're done with this portion, we're going to raise an offering to fund the kind of work that we're talking about, and now really excited to continue and partner with our brothers and sisters around the world, actually. So, first question. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do have a question. I'll be brief, not a statement. I work in a wealthy county in Maryland, and so I'm around people with wealth, and I do organizing around poverty issues. But what was the main thing, Sister Anna, when you were working with the banks that brought them around to your point of view and came up with that money? Was it guilt? Was it, I want to get these folks out of my face? What was it, would you say, was that main kind of ingredient? Appealing to their conscience? What was it?
Leverage.
Leverage.
The first thing that we had to do, we had to go to the Episcopal Bishop, Bishop White. We had to go to the Lutheran Bishop, Bishop Weakland. We had to go to Bishop Rockins of the ELCA and said, if this doesn't move, will you pull everything out of these banks? And to be honest with you, I have no idea what that meant. But it sounded really good. And of course, they supported our cause. Out of Micah, I started working with leaders and religious leaders, and we created Wisdom, a statewide power. And I went back to the bishop after the win and said, we need statewide power. And they say, we will support building a statewide organization as long as it doesn't have interfaith in the name. There's too many interfaith organizations. But we had leverage, and it took us 4 years. The campaign, building up the campaign, building on the campaign. So we had to stick to it. We had to see it as a long term. And we had to do a power analysis to see where the points, where we could put the pressure points. So all the stuff that we learn in organizing, how to do a power analysis, how to do power one-on-ones, and how to harvest allies. And for us, it was bishops. They were the strongest allies. Thank you.
Our church is located in lower middle class to middle class African American Hispanic community. And the sense I get is that you can't really get them active because they're comfortable. They figure they've gotten a certain level and they have a home and they have, their children, they can send them to another school, not in the neighborhood. How do you light a fire under these people to let them understand that they are totally underserved?
Send the organizer, right? I do feel that lighting a fire is complicated because there's not one fire. We started this campaign called the Fire of Faith, and we figured that would solve every problem because everybody understood, what the fire of faith was. I think when you have to know your people and you have to have professional organizers that are going to be with you for the long run, for the long haul. I think we want to come into the church, tell them there's something good they should join and support, and we get very disappointed. I think I'm the only one in my church who still read the bulletin because I'm a bulletin junkie. I really am. I'm sorry. So I think that you have to come up, be creative, and you have to know your people. And you know, when it boils down to it, I'm not ashamed to feed people, but it has to start somewhere, right? So I feel like there's not a, Reverend said it, there's not just one formula to activate people, because we all are called by different ways and different strategy. So, but as long as our preacher keep preaching and agitating, and they stop preaching about being modest and humble, and really preach to us about being powerful and taking off the powers and principality, then that's halfway there.
No, it was good. It was a good question. I just want to add two quick things. So one is that, I think it is imperative for churches and pastors in churches, or even lay leaders in churches, to encourage and cajole your church members to break out of their comfort zone, whatever that means, whatever that requires, because that really is a requirement of the gospel. And so, I'm grateful at Alfred Street Baptist Church. We are a pretty wealthy black church in Alexandria. But if you look at our ministries and our reach, we are providing thousands of meals to people in our community. We are partnering with historically black colleges and helping to raise money to ensure that they can keep their doors open and they can be strong. We are doing a number of things that enable people to be able to break out of that comfort zone, or to be able to directly provide direct, tangible support and solidarity to others. And I guess the other piece of it is just more from a theological perspective. I think we really need to emphasize those themes in the Bible that are clear about our interdependence. Paul is very clear in his letter to the Corinthian church that when one body of the body suffers, all parts suffer with it. When one part rejoices, all parts rejoice with it, right? So we are interdependent, and sometimes I feel like that message doesn't come through strong enough.
It's remarkable for us to be gathering across denominations with like-minded focus on troubling the water, but we have within the Christian faith in America a deep chasm that we haven't talked about, that there is a major part of the Christian faith in North America, in the United States, that has a long history of supporting slavery, of supporting suppression, and we haven't addressed how we try to focus on bridging that chasm. Because if as Christians we can't bridge that chasm, we're not going to solve the rest of the problems that go with it. We can't solve the political problems. We can't solve the social problems. We've got to address the Christian problem in the United States. How do we approach that?
Thank you. I think we need at least another day to really address that question. But let me say this. I mentioned it in my remarks, but I really encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, watch this video, Reclaiming Jesus. You can watch it at reclaimingjesus.org. It is an effort to try to speak to the heart of that question. It gets directly into issues of racism, of xenophobia, and it's really speaking to all the church. But in some ways, it is trying to extend an olive branch to those parts of the church that may currently be directly supporting our current president, or be swayed by some of the things he's saying. And it's an effort to try to build a bridge. And so, certainly more efforts are needed beyond that, but I think that video and that statement is at least one effort from some really recognizable church leaders from across the various faith traditions of the Christian church that is a really important, powerful one. Sojourners is in the process of developing a program that we're going to call the Faith and Justice Church Network. And we are going to be more intentional about developing a series of tools and resources to help churches do three things. One is to become more civically engaged and empowered, to get their members to register to vote, to be educated about the issues that are at stake in the election, all in a nonpartisan way, and to get out the vote. The second is to empower churches to engage and build social justice ministries. And the third is directly tied into your question, which is how do particularly politically divided congregations have conversation and dialogue about contentious issues? How do we model a way to talk about tough issues that doesn't just mirror the culture we're in, which is extremely polarized and has all the name calling and the zero-sum way of thinking, but how do we do it in a way that models Christ? And we're going to profile churches that have done this well. We're going to offer some concrete examples and tools that hopefully will benefit churches of many different stripes, and including, some churches that are much more on the conservative end of the spectrum.
Okay, last two questions. One here in the front, and then the young lady in the aisle.
Last year, when we went to Congress, we heard several offices say, "We're so busy whacking moles, we don't have time for strategy." And I want to lift up your having spent a stint at the World Bank, because every one of the individual kind of injustices that we've been addressing are impacted by the economic system that has, over the last 35 years, transmitted most of what our society creates in terms of value into the hands of the very wealthy instead of back into the hands of the people who produce the wealth. So you probably know that Stiglitz wrote a book with probably 130 policy recommendations, every single one of which is something that our legislators can enact, and every single one of which increases the size and vitality of the economy and empowers more individual people. So for those of us who know that violence against women in Central America is mostly the result of poverty, and the reason why black people in Oakland can't afford a house is because they can't get a living wage, we need to hear people like you in conversation with people like Anna to put out a vision that says we have to look at this larger economic picture to change the structure. And something like the Green New Deal seems like a great way to start. Can we hear you talk about that larger vision a little bit? Sorry, it wasn't shorter.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take this question as well, and then our presenters will answer both of them. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for taking this question. I'm a little late to the advocacy game, and I'm embarrassed by my white privilege to say that I hadn't really been tuned in at all. I hadn't been tuned in until our president became our president, and at that point I decided that I was uncomfortable allowing the conservative religious movement to, I wasn't going to let them have my voice. And so I have started doing some things that have been, I didn't even know that I would be thinking about. But the point of my question is, I came to Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago as a sponsor of a youth group trip, and while we were there, we stopped at the ELCA advocacy office. I have been a Lutheran my whole life and didn't even know that that was a thing. So now that I am, and again, my ignorance, not their fault, my ignorance. So I am a 50-year-old white woman with a set of skills, and I am interested in not only volunteering, because I do understand that it is a vocation, and I get feeding people and I get working with folks, but how does one enter into this type of work on a more professional level 50 years in with gray hair? And I'm happy to speak with people later, but maybe there are some other folks here who are interested in an entry point. No, I'm not dyeing my hair. I'm not doing it.
Well, Adam and I are going to try to answer both, and I do think that we need to begin, and we talked about this yesterday, about how to cast a vision and begin to work closer together. So you're right on point, but I also want you to see me afterward, because we're always looking for organizers, and we have 3 times a year a week-long training. And we have training of trainers. And we also have Entosaki, she who walks with lions and carries her own thing. So it's how we train and develop women either for organizing political office or whatever they want to do and who they want to be in the world. So those are opportunities. There are a lot of places that you can go to become a professional organizer.
Yeah. Thanks, Anna. So I wholeheartedly agree. We need a radical, bold economic vision for our country and for the world more broadly. Some of you are familiar with the set of goals that got agreed to about 2 years ago called the Sustainable Development Goals. It replaced the Millennium Development Goals. They're not perfect, but it is a bold vision. And there's a lot in that agenda that many countries are paying attention to, that are combining a commitment to ending extreme poverty, to combating inequality, to improving governance and fighting corruption, to caring for the environment and fighting climate change. Unfortunately, our country, as of late, has pretty much ignored this entire agenda. But many other countries are paying attention and it's gaining traction. So I do think the Sustainable Development Goals agenda provides some good tools and some good ideas. But in the context of the United States, I think there's some great ideas that were put together in the Poor People's Campaign platform that we should really be paying attention to. I'm very inspired by the Green New Deal. I do think that it is more of a messaging document rather than a full policy blueprint. And I think it needs to be translated into a policy blueprint that we can advocate on together. I didn't mention this earlier, but Sojourners and many others of your denominations and other organizations came together about 10 years ago to form what's called the Circle of Protection, which is the largest, most ecumenical coalition that has been working to try to ensure that there's a powerful voice in Congress on behalf of the poorest of the poor, particularly low-income Americans in this country. They've been advocating to ensure that cuts aren't made to programs that benefit low-income Americans. And because of the advocacy of the Catholic bishops and the National Association of Evangelicals and the National Council of Churches and Sojourners and Bread for the World and so many others, they have played a huge role in protecting much of that funding, despite many efforts to make cuts. And so, as we like to say, budgets are moral documents. We have to be diligent about advocating for those things that are a reflection of our values and that would care for the poor. The last thing I would say is that one of the reasons I decided to come back, but decided to go into the bank and become an employee of the bank, if you will, is because Dr. Jim Kim, who became the president about 6 years ago, had been casting a very bold vision for the bank. And what he would say is that the bank often was known for prioritizing a preferential option for economic growth. And I think that's been true of our dominant economic model for far too long, from the structural adjustment days even to the present. But what he tried to do, and you could argue how successful he was, is try to get the World Bank to really prioritize a preferential option for the poor. And because of activism, the bank has changed significantly in the last 20 years. I couldn't have worked at the bank had there not been a significant amount of change already that had taken place. Much more, I think, can take place, needs to take place going forward. But I'm just using that as an example of how activism really can transform huge institutions like the World Bank and can help to reshape economic policy in ways that will have a ripple effect across people's lives. We have so much more work to be done, but let's take inspiration in some of the good work that has come before us.